Welcome back, everybody. Well, unless you are absolutely brand new to the channel or you've been living under a rock, you know I'm headed to Europe next week. And we're going to be covering the events of Operation Market Garden, as well as some of the events associated with the Battle of the Bulge. Mostly going to be walking in the footsteps of American paratroopers, but we're also going to be taking a look at some locations concerning some of the Russian troops that were over on the Western Front being used for labor. We're also going to be taking a look at some of the British and Commonwealth forces as well. So I'm excited for that. And with that in mind, I thought it was a good time to dive into a little bit of the overall history of Operation Market Garden. So we're going to be visiting our friend, the Armchair Historian, to get his take on Operation Market Garden. And as always, I will fill in what I know here and there. I am by no means an expert on Operation Market Garden. I have been consuming all the information I can in the last few weeks as I prepare for my trip, and I certainly will know a lot more when I get back than I do right now. But let's go ahead and take a look. As always, the link's in the description if you want to check out the original content without my commentary. Here we go.
Excited to announce that today's video is sponsored by Audible. More on that later.
Audible, sponsor me.
Hi,
I
I'm
use your
Griffin
books all the
Johnson,
time.
the Armchair Historian. Today's video, Operation Market Garden, a World War II tutorial on how not to use paratroopers. On September 17, 1944, several thousand Allied airborne dropped from the skies into the Nazi-occupied Netherlands. More landed the next day and the day after. Comprising British, American, and even Polish troops, this force constituted the single largest airborne operation in history. Its objective was to open up a route to the German industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, in an attempt to end the war early. Instead, Market Garden ended up being one of the greatest Allied setbacks of the Second World War. In this video, we're going to be going through the operation day by day and location by location to explore why Market Garden was a bridge too far.
So, one of the reasons why, he mentioned at the beginning, this is how not to use paratroopers. So the paratroopers are the elite fighting force of the day. They had trained a lot. They were trained for special operations. They were intended to be dropped behind enemy lines. The Germans had used paratroopers very early in the war. The Americans had used paratroopers before Normandy. The 82nd Airborne had been used prior to that. But the 101st, for example, the first time they get used is in Normandy, and they train for 2 years for that. So they do their combat drop in Normandy, and then they fight on the ground for a while, but they're not intended to be frontline kind of combat troops to push the line forward. They're intended for special missions, and they kept planning for new missions, and then what happened was, they were bogged down for a while in Normandy, and then the breakout happens in August of 1944, and the Allied army starts moving rapidly toward Paris, toward Germany, and so they keep training for these missions, and the drop zones, the places where they're supposed to land for these missions, keep getting overrun because the breakout happens so quickly. And so by September of 1944, they've got this elite fighting force in the form of these paratroopers, the 101st, the 82nd Airborne, the British 1st Airborne, and they're not being used for what they were created for. So they're looking, part of the problem is that they're looking for an opportunity to use them. And so in some sense, they actually create the opportunity rather than using them just as opportunities arise, because, they're getting antsy. They're not being used properly. So Market Garden, that was kind of a mistake from the beginning to think, well, we've got to use these paratroopers, so let's come up with an operation that's daring that we can use them. It doesn't mean Operation Market Garden was necessarily a bad idea. It was years later, I think a couple decades later, after Dwight Eisenhower had left the White House, and he was doing an interview, I think on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, and they were asking him about Market Garden. And he said, well, I had to. I mean, when this mission was presented to me, if there was any chance at all it was going to succeed, we had to take that chance. And in hindsight, it's easy to judge it, but it was the right decision at the time.
Market Garden was the brainchild of Bernard Montgomery, famous for commanding British forces during the late North African campaign. It was designed to test Bernard's favored strategy for the final phase of the war in Europe by concentrating Allied forces for a small yet powerful thrust into Germany.
There was this ongoing debate. You know, everybody always talks about the rivalry between Montgomery and Patton. These are the two most daring Allied commanders. You've got the British commander, and you've got Patton, this American commander. And Patton, in his diary, spoke with great respect for Monty. Even though they had a rivalry, even though maybe publicly he wasn't real supportive of him, he had a lot of respect for Montgomery as a commanding officer. But they had differing philosophies about how the war should be won. Patton favored kind of brute force, hit them direct and just drive them back rapidly. Monty preferred this kind of precision pinpoint strike into the heart of Germany, and that was what wins out. And part of this is that Eisenhower is constantly dealing with the politics of all of this. Being an American, that's also got to give kind of weight to the British ideas and proposals, and in this case, he actually chooses Montgomery over Patton. Patton's down here trying to break through the Siegfried line, and he diverts supplies from what Patton's trying to do and basically shuts Patton down in favor of Monty. So this is political, but it's also a daring strategy to try and win the war.
Allied commander Dwight Eisenhower, whom Montgomery often clashed with, had been championing a so-called broad strategy of keeping Allied forces distributed along a wide front, putting pressure on German positions along the entire border. When offensive progress began to slow following the liberation of Brussels in early September, Eisenhower gave the go-ahead to implement a smaller-scale version of Montgomery's plans for a narrow front. His approval was designed to test both the strategic viability of such a thrust and the effectiveness of the Allied airborne army, still relatively new to the field of battle. So what was Montgomery's proposal? The plan called for a massive flanking maneuver around the heavily fortified German Siegfried line through the Low Countries. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what the Germans did to the French in both World Wars, with varying degrees of success. Hey, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? Market Garden was actually the combination of two component operations named, you guessed it, Market and Garden.
So Market is the Allied airborne drops, and they're meant to drop and grab all the bridges. Garden's the thrust up with armored.
Market was the airborne component, in which paratroopers would land at several points between the Dutch cities of Arnhem and Eindhoven to secure the bridges over the Meuse, Veyle, and Lower Rhine rivers, as well as a number of canals. If you've ever been to the Netherlands, you'll know it's about 70% river, so these points had to be taken before Operation Garden, the large-scale deployment of armor over the Dutch-German border, could commence.
So why do they have to be taken? Well, it's simple, because if you're the Germans and you're defending and you're trying to keep the Allies from advancing, and you know that they're bringing armor up that one main road, and you're defending an area that's full of rivers and canals, well, what's the first thing you're going to do is blow the bridges. So the airborne had to get there and get there fast in order to secure these bridges before the Germans even had an opportunity to blow them up, which you would think, what's the most important aspect to this? Is drop your airborne troops as close as you possibly can to the bridges. Well, it doesn't work out that way, and that's kind of the first major problem with this whole process.
This joint force, which consisted of 50,000 troops of the 30th Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Herricks, was to begin in the southwest and end at Arnhem. Allied commanders hoped that if Market Garden was successful, they could end the war by Christmas of 1944. Before we delve into the details about what exactly transpired, there's a few things we should go over. First off, to those who don't know already, paratroopers are light infantry units who can't carry very heavy weapons, so historically they have had to rely on surprise and speed to gain the advantage. Throughout this video, you'll notice how the Allies failed to play at those strengths.
Now, I will say this, yes, absolutely true. Paratroopers are light infantry, and so they're not supported by things like armor. They did, however, they have mortars. They've got, I think, 60 and 81 millimeter mortars. They've also got some small artillery. They were able to bring in with gliders some small artillery pieces, but nothing that's going to help you against armor. They're meant to be fighting against other infantry, and that's it.
Moreover, Operation Market Garden was predicated on an overly optimistic timetable that assumed that the paratroopers could hold out long enough for the 30th Corps to reach them.
It also was based on a faulty assumption that the troops defending this area were all kids and old men. And there was actually an elite panzer unit that was there. It had been sent there to recoup and relax and refit on a quiet sector of the line before being brought back to the main battlefront against Patton and the Siegfried Line, things like that. So it happened to be there when all this goes down.
On top of that, the soft Dutch soil was judged to be impassable for mechanized and heavy armor, so the 30th Corps had to follow a single paved highway. That narrow channel of movement left them badly exposed to German anti-tank fire from all sides while traveling.
One of the main aspects of combat is that you funnel your enemy into a killing zone. Right? You defend everything really heavy, but you leave spots. They did this in World War I. You've got all your barbed wire, but you've got gaps in the barbed wire, and that's where all your machine guns are going to be able to just mow down the enemy in the killing zone. Same thing here. You've got a predetermined killing zone because all the armor's got to come up this one road, so you know that that's the only area you have to defend against with your anti-armor.
Furthermore, Allied planners did not heed a report from the Dutch resistance that a veteran Panzer Corps was stationed nearby, undergoing maintenance, but still capable of defensive deployment.
The Allies vastly undervalued the Dutch resistance. The Dutch resistance was probably the best. It wasn't the biggest, but it probably was the most effective and the most well-prepared resistance anywhere in Western Europe. And the minute the paratroopers showed up, the Dutch resistance was there and ready and willing to help. And it took a while to get the Allied forces to recognize the value of the underground.
Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a great way to lose rock, paper, scissors. Or, infantry tank, anti-tank. Now, let's get on to the operation. Tomorrow, we go into action. If by sacrificing all this, I leave a world slightly better than I found it, I am perfectly willing to make that sacrifice. Private Ivor Robbery, South Stratfordshire Regiment, killed in action, September 17th, 1944.
Staffordshire!
An air armada of nearly 1,500 Allied aircraft and more than 400 gliders take to the skies.
So if you're not familiar with airborne operations, these gliders are basically bricks with wings. I don't know how else to describe them. They don't have engines. They're just designed to be towed by these, I guess the C-47s. They're towed by these larger planes by a rope, basically. It's a cable. And then they release it, and the glider literally does what it's called. It glides, and it doesn't even have landing gear. It just kind of skids on the ground. So if there's trees, if there's anything in the way, like in Normandy, Rommel had them put these defenses, these poles that would keep the gliders from being able to land effectively. And if your glider came, hit and stopped real quickly, all the equipment that was in the glider would go flying up to the front and kill everybody in the front, and that happened sometimes. But it was on these gliders that they were able to put things like Jeeps, small artillery pieces, other things that couldn't be carried by paratroopers that were jumping out of airplanes. And so these were essential, and there were fields where hundreds of these gliders would land, and you can see photographs of the gliders just sitting all over the place.
The paratroopers aboard these planes will be dropped far into enemy territory, completely surrounded and nearly 60 miles away from friendly territory. In the early afternoon, the first paratroopers hit the ground. The initial insertions are actually quite successful, with soldiers at all major sites accurately hitting their landing zones.
For the most part, there were some mistakes. The 505th, for example, which was part of the 82nd Airborne, I believe a big chunk of them were supposed to land south of Groesbeck. I can't pronounce that properly. I know it's got that hard G going on. But there was a mistake in the air when they were all taken off. And so a lot of them ended up being dropped east of town when they were supposed to be dropped south of town. So there were mistakes. There were planes that got shot down. It wasn't, I know that in Band of Brothers they portray this as just this beautiful Sunday morning landing where everything went perfect. The weather was great. There was no opposition. That was true for the guys in the 506th, Easy Company, the Band of Brothers guys. That was not true everywhere. There was opposition. There were some missed drops. It just wasn't nearly the disaster of missed drops and planes being shot down and things like that Normandy had been.
However, Lloyd Clark, a military historian at the University of Buckingham, notes that the Allied operation began with airborne troops accurately hitting their drop zones, yet their very success actually assisted the German response from the start. Because the troops weren't scattered, the Germans could easily pinpoint where they had hit the ground and make a quick deduction of the likely objectives of the Allied operation.
That's a great point, because the scattered misdrops actually can create more confusion. Interesting.
Furthest to the north is Arnhem, where the 1st British Airborne Division under Major General Roy Auchart are to take a road bridge and a rail bridge that both cross the Lower Rhine. Auchart's force lands a dozen miles to the west of their targets due to a concentration of German anti-aircraft batteries near the town of Oosterbeek. They are forced to fight through scattered German opposition to reach their objectives.
And if you've seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, which covers Market Garden, you see a little bit of the debate that goes on ahead of time about the 1st Airborne's landing zones being so far from Arnhem and their objectives. The whole point of the airborne is that you need to get them as close as possible to the objectives. 12 miles gives the Germans all sorts of time to organize a defense, and the 1st Airborne was just set up for disaster from the beginning by being dropped so far.
This resistance does not initially stop Auchart's men, but it does seriously delay them. What's more, the Allies lack enough planes to transport all of the men required for this attack. Thus, a large contingent of the 1st Airborne must stay behind to protect the landing sites and supply drops.
Yeah, let's talk about these planes for a second, because I want to look this up to be sure. I don't want to give you wrong information, but I think the 82nd Airborne alone required 2,000 planes to transport everybody. So they didn't have nearly enough, because I think there were only a little less than 4,000 planes available for all of the Allied units that had to be dropped. Okay, so I was way off. So on day one, I thought there were like 3,600 planes that were involved in all of this. But according to this information here, landing the airborne forces took approximately 1,300 plane loads of paratroopers and airdropped artillery and 2,500 gliders. Okay, so that's why we're counting the gliders in the planes. So 1,049 C-47s dropped the paratroopers. 145 dropped the 1st Airborne Brigade, 1st Airborne Division personnel, including men of the Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. 480 C-47s dropped the 82nd Airborne Division, including all 3 parachute infantry regiments, which took 117 planes each, and 1 parachute artillery battalion, 48 planes. And then 424 C-47s for the 101st Airborne Division, including all 3 PIRs. So there it gives you a little bit more of a sense of that. The majority of the planes that get counted in that total then are 2,500 gliders.
In yet another stroke of bad luck, the radio sets the British are using experience technical failure that effectively eliminates General Ockhart's ability to communicate with his men or with artillery and air support.
Brutal.
While the Germans are getting more organized, the Allies are getting progressively less organized. Only the 750-man 2nd Battalion, commanded by John Frost, reaches either of the division's objectives.
And the bridge there in Arnhem, the famous Bridge Too Far, is named the John Frost Bridge today.
Their secondary objective, a rail bridge, is destroyed just as they arrive, so they hastily move on towards their primary target, the Arnhem Bridge, and hold up in 18 houses just north of the bridge. Reinforcements are stopped by the German Kampfgruppe Spindler, assembled primarily from elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, leaving Frost on his own for the time being. To the south, the U.S. 82nd Airborne Infantry Division, under Brigadier General Jim Gavin, or Jumpin' Jim as his men like to call him, lands with 7,500 troops near Nijmegen. They take these...
Interesting, he was in fact a brigadier general at the time, which typically divisions are commanded by major generals, but he was a brigadier general, though this image shows him as a major general, 2 stars.
Southernmost of their 2 objectives, a bridge over the Maas River, as well as the undefended Groesbeck Heights to the southeast, where supplies and reinforcements will be dropped in the coming days. From here, they begin shelling the nearby forest of Reichswald, from which they expect a German counterattack.
The whole thing was about getting it across and into Germany, but the 101st or the 82nd Airborne, like elements of the 505th, I think the 508th was in there too. They landed like within sight of Germany. They were maybe a mile or 2 away from the German border. In fact, this forest is in Germany. We're going to visit the Reichswald Forest British Commonwealth cemetery that's in German territory.
Though they aren't certain. Later that same day, a small detachment of 400 men is sent to capture the 2nd bridge over the Veil River, just north of Nijmegen. Unfortunately for the Americans, the 10th SS Panzer Division, made up of approximately 3,000 men, rushes in to stop them from reaching their objective. In Eindhoven, the 101st Airborne under Maxwell D. Taylor lands and captures 3 of 5 intended targets.
Now this is funny because Max Taylor was a major general, 2 stars, and he's shown as a 1 star. I'm not sure the rhyme or reason here, but they're probably based on real photographs, I would guess.
Crucially, however, the men of the 101st fail to take the crossings at Best and Sun, which Nazi forces blow up behind them.
So the bridge at Zolln, which was the 506th, I think, initial target, in his book, Dick Winters talks about approaching the bridge, and I think he said he was something like 20 or 30 meters from the bridge when it exploded. And he describes how he thinks to himself, man, I've survived Normandy, I've survived being shot at all these times, and I'm going to die from splinters from an exploding bridge, because it's all raining down around him. And that's what he's thinking is, man, this is a heck of a way to die. But yeah, the Zolln Bridge was one of the very first places the British 30th Corps is going to get to, because the 101st had the southernmost area of responsibility, and so they immediately have to get to work with trying to create a crossing there. So they get in some boats and they row across to secure the other side, and then they've got to get engineers to lay down a bridge. All of this is going to slow them down.
Both of these bridges cross the same canal, so at least one has to be reconstructed if troops are going to cross. The process greatly slows down the advance. Worse still, an Allied glider attached to the 101st crashes, and plans for the entire operation fall into German hands. Despite some success, Operation Market Garden is not exactly off to an auspicious start.
Not at all.
The landing was due at 10 o'clock, but it came and went, and no aircraft, gliders, or anything appeared. Gordon Jock Walker, Sergeant, British Army Film and Photographic Unit. The next morning, poor weather in England prevents the launch of a 2nd Airborne Wave that was initially scheduled for 0600 hours. That deployment, and many of the subsequent supply drops scheduled for today, fail to arrive on time, if they arrive at all. As dawn breaks, John Frost is all alone. He and the 2nd Battalion are in Arnhem, repelling contingents of the Kampfgruppe Spindler that scrambled up from Nijmegen to the south the night before.
And that right there is the bridge you see here that's called the John Frost Bridge.
The 2nd Battalion is doing an admirable job, but is surrounded and running low on supplies. The 1st and 3rd slowly make their way into western Arnhem, but are stopped by German forces in the city and do not successfully link up with the 2nd. Meanwhile, the 4th Battalion finally makes their landing, but does not join the rest of the division on this day. Ockart himself is pinned down during the advance of the 1st Battalion and actually hides inside of a Dutch house for the day.
And I think Urquhart was played by Sean Connery in the movie. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about that.
A functioning radio to keep in contact with his men, he is considered missing in action, thereby putting Brigadier General Philip Hicks in temporary command. In Nijmegen, the Americans of the 82nd have beaten back a small German attack and are reinforced with a second wave of paratroopers. However, they have yet to take the all-important Veil Bridge, and the Germans have begun crossing the river by boat, setting up defensive positions around the Americans' objectives. German commanders, now in possession of the Allied war plans, conclude that victory at Nijmegen is crucial to the overall defeat of Market Garden. Victory at Arnhem and Eindhoven would be meaningless without a route between them. Speaking of which, the British 30th Corps arrives in Eindhoven late in the day and begins construction of a makeshift bridge, while the 101st Airborne holds off attacks from a handful of hastily assembled German forces from the west.
So yes, Sean Connery did play Major General Urquhart. Ryan O'Neal plays General Gavin. I think, who was it? Oh my gosh, I can't remember his name now. Famous actor, one of my all-time favorites, and when I have to think of things in the middle of things, I forget. Paul Maxwell played Maxwell Taylor. Paul Maxwell you might know from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He's the guy who takes the Cross of Coronado from Indiana Jones on the boat before it explodes. Indiana Jones gets it back from him on the boat before it explodes. That was Paul Maxwell. Gene Hackman plays General Sosabowski, who was the Polish commander of their airborne troops.
I think we're going a bridge too far. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning apocryphally during the planning of Operation Market Garden. In Arnhem, John Frost is outnumbered, outgunned, and becoming increasingly desperate. His forces now occupy only 10 houses on the northern side of Arnhem Bridge. The 2nd Battalion is unable to stop German tanks from crossing and comes under heavy artillery fire. The remaining battalions make one more push to move through western Arnhem and are beaten back so severely that they actually have to retreat past their original landing zones, meaning that the Germans would get their hands on all of the new supplies.
So here's the problem with Market Garden from the beginning. It requires everything to work. Any one component of this fails, it's not like you can make up for it elsewhere. It's got to all work. So you've got to have the 101st secure those initial objectives so that the 30th Corps can get up through Zaan, through Eindhoven. You've got to have the 82nd securing their objectives so you can get up through Nijmegen and make your way to the outskirts of Arnhem. And you've got to have the British 1st Airborne and the Polish troops take Arnhem and secure those bridges for all of this to work. Any one of those pieces fail, and within each one of those pieces, there are a million things that can go wrong, and a bunch of them do. And so while it was a really audacious plan, it's a plan that didn't have any room for error at all.
In the confusion, Ockart does manage to rejoin the 1st Airborne, at least what was left of it. Meanwhile, the 1st Polish Independent Paratrooper Brigade, meant to reinforce the British division, is still unable to deploy because of poor weather in England and the Netherlands. Meanwhile, the 30th Corps finishes construction and proceeds to Nijmegen, where it links up with the 82nd Airborne. The newly combined force attempts to take the Veil Bridge, but advances only slowly. Lastly, the 101st Airborne is still holding its position in the south and repels a counterattack against the makeshift crossing by the 107th Panzer Division. Hand grenades flew in every direction. Each house had to be taken this way. Some of the British offered resistance to their last breath. A German soldier at Arnhem. The rest of the 1st Airborne gives up hope of reaching the 2nd Battalion, as it is pushed into an increasingly compact area around eastern Oosterbeek. Frost himself is captured. The Polish reinforcements are nowhere to be found. However, hope comes from the south, as Allied forces in Nijmegen finally make some progress. By sending a contingent of troops across the river by boat and attacking the Germans from the rear, the 30th Corps and 82nd Airborne finally take control of the bridge at Nijmegen by the end of the day. The retreating Germans attempt and fail to destroy the crossing on their way out. Surprisingly, the 30th Corps does not immediately move out, as several of their elements are still pinned down in the city. A rare bright spot for the Allies in this operation, the capture of Nijmegen means that the center of their corridor is secure for now. Out of ammunition. God save the King.
One of my all-time favorite quotes from the war.
The 2nd Battalion, 1st British Airborne Division, on September 24th, 1944.
Think about that. Think about what's going on there in that moment. Think about the attitude of these men. Their last transmission, out of ammunition. God save the King. We're going to go down fighting. Oh, it gives me chills just thinking about what these guys did. Incredible.
2nd Battalion, 1st British Airborne Division, on September 24th, 1944. The 2nd Battalion at Arnhem Bridge is completely wiped out by overwhelming German forces today, ending their impressive holdout. Approximately 1,984 men are killed and 6,854 captured. Ockart does not have time to grieve. The remaining members of the 1st Airborne, now only 3,500 out of 10,000, try to hold on to a strip of land north of the river where a potential new bridge could be constructed. Throughout the day, 750 Polish fighters, roughly at half strength under Stanisław Sosabowski, finally touched down in Driel.
He's actually... That's the Gene Hackman version. I love it. That's awesome.
Southeast under a rain of gunfire. The onslaught decimates them as the 30th Corps, relentlessly harassed by German artillery fire, finally gets in range of Oosterbeek and starts to provide supporting fire. The soldier on the stretcher at my feet lay upwards, his eyes heavily bandaged. I had no further use now for my steel helmet, so I took it off and covered his face. Godfrey Friedman, British glider pilot, captured at Arnhem. Today, the tides really start to turn against the Allies. In Arnhem, 60 Poles managed to cross the Rhine and join with the 1st Airborne, which itself is now running out of supplies. Bad weather has deprived them of crucial air support as well as the ability to resupply.
Now remember that all of these guys have no idea what's happening in the rest of Operation Market Garden. They don't know if the armor's about to show up, if they're just hanging on long enough. You know, by this point, the armor's supposed to have arrived. This mission's supposed to be over. They're supposed to have been able to secure their objectives, and the armor's going to arrive and save the day, and everything's going to be fine. So they're hanging on, hoping. And I'm guessing the average soldier on the ground has no idea what's going on with the rest of Operation Market Garden.
When German Colonel Kurt Student launches a massive counterattack against both sides of the Eindhoven-Nijmegen corridor, the 30th Corps and 82nd Airborne have to take valuable time to re-establish a link to the south. Ockart is still alone, and the walls are closing in. German snipers are beginning to infiltrate his lines, and he has fewer than 2,000 utterly exhausted men left. Saturday morning, a brief truce is declared, and 1,200 wounded British and Polish soldiers are taken prisoner. We did not get our final bridgehead, and that must be admitted. General Bernard Montgomery. A small number of men from the 30th Corps manages to reach Driel and establishes a connection with what's left of the 1st Airborne, while 300 more Poles make it across the river in attack boats. All of this is too little, too late. Allied commanders are no longer discussing the possibility of reinforcement. Their only hope is evacuation. Under the cover of darkness and artillery fire, the 1st Airborne Division and their Polish allies make their way across the Rhine and back to safety. All told, 1,741 of the 10,000 men dropped as part of the 1st Airborne Division make it back to Allied territory. So, what went wrong?
80%
Basically,
casualties.
Everything, even the weather. As we've already mentioned, the airborne troops were ill-equipped to face armored divisions stationed in the area, and the Germans seemed to know exactly where to place their defenders. That problem was compounded by the fact that the British Army lacked the aircraft to drop the 1st Airborne all at once. You tend to lose the element of surprise when you have to drop your men into the same spot over multiple days. Members of the Dutch underground provided warnings about the 99th Panzers, but may have also compromised the operation from the start. The Germans as a whole were also being commanded by a renowned defensive strategist, Field Marshal Walter Model, who was able to oversee his forces from his HQ in Arnhem itself. As for Allied command, historians tend to focus on Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, who was in charge of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. But their focus was not one born out of admiration, but rather of sharp criticism. In fact, many historians, as well as General John Frost, point to him as bearing at least some of the blame for why the operation went downhill. Rather than any one issue in particular, a number of factors had to go wrong all at once for Market Garden to fail as spectacularly as it did.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. To have it fail as spectacularly as it did, but I would still maintain that Market Garden was an operation that from the beginning had a very small margin for error compared to a lot of other operations. In a lot of other battles, a lot of things can go wrong and you can still find a way to be successful. But one of the other problems here is that because you're all spread out and because people are behind the enemy line, sometimes as far as 60 miles behind lines, when you start losing command and control, you can't make adjustments based on what happens. No plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, the plan was flawed from the beginning, and then it got even worse once it made contact with the enemy. But you can't make adjustments when you can't contact all of your troops and give orders, and they're operating under their initial orders and under the initial plan. That can't really be changed. So there's very small margin for error there.
Among these problems were the placement of the 1st Airborne's drop zone too far from Arnhem Bridge, its communication blackout, the 24-hour delay of the 30th Corps, the decision at Nijmegen to delay the capture of the Vale Bridge by several hours after landing, ultimately delaying the 30th Corps even further, and relentlessly unfavorable weather. Nonetheless, Market Garden was not a complete failure, at least according to the memoir of Bernard Montgomery, published 14 years later.
I knew my stuff, sir, and that, I think, was a...
Did you ever lose a battle, Field Marshal?
No.
Yes, that's the important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, you did. Montgomery was, everybody looks for a scapegoat, right? Somebody wants to blame the Polish. Montgomery wants to blame the Polish, which is ridiculous. They were the least of the problems in that action. But this was his baby. This was his brainchild. He was the one who came up with it. He was the one who pushed for it. He lobbied Eisenhower to make it happen. Ain't nobody else can take blame for this but Montgomery. Was it his fault that some of that stuff went wrong? No. But the buck stops here. He is ultimately responsible for this. It doesn't mean he wasn't a great general. He was. He had a lot of great victories, did some wonderful things. But this one's all on him.
If you'd like to learn more about...
All right, so I guess we're going to wrap it up right there. Let me know your thoughts about all that. Like I said, not an expert on this. I'm hoping to learn a whole lot next week when I go. Use the comment section below and add to the discussion. Let's learn together about all of this. And this will hardly be the last video that we do talking about Operation Market Garden. We're going to start to get into some of the details as I record my content for the channel next week. Thanks for watching.